Welcome to episode 22 of the Tax Professionals podcast. In this episode, we discuss 8 revision tips for the CTA and ATT exams.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Becoming CTA and ATT qualified was probably one of the most difficult things that I've ever done. Even more difficult than my maths degree. And that's primarily down to the limited amount of time that I had to study around working full time, and I think that that's probably what most people find the most challenging about it too. So in this episode, I'm giving 8 revision tips to help motivate yourself and best utilise the available time that you have for revision to help you maximise your chances of passing the exams. Just before we jump into the episode, you can get a written summary of the tips mentioned in this episode, so you don't need to take notes by heading on over to the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP22. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP22. The summary is intended to supplement the episode rather than replace it, so if you want full details, take a listen to the full episode. Without further ado, let's get to it. So tip number 1, I just want to give this a very quick mention, but if you haven't already, make sure that you have studied all of the material, and yes, I do mean all of the material. The May 2021 exams, and it looks like the exams going forward as well, will all be open book, but don't underestimate them just because they are going to be open book. You still need to study all of the material and understand all of it, and if you do that, you'll be able to get as much benefit as possible out of the revision phase. Even though you will be able to take whatever materials you want into the exam and use them, you'll still need to be able to spot the tax issues that are in point in the question. And if you don't understand and know the material, then you won't be able to do that. So taking in a full study manual or whatever information you take in will not be useful if you don't even know what the tax points in play are. So please do make sure that you study and understand the material. That doesn't necessarily mean remember all of it, but study and understand it. So tip number 2 is be effective with your study time. So as I've already alluded to at the start of this episode, one of the hardest things about studying towards the ATT and the CTA exam is having enough time to learn and to revise the material. Because when you're working full time, you have little time after work and on weekends to study and revise. So making sure that you can get as much benefit out of the time you do have is going to be super important. And you know, after a hard day at work, the last thing that I wanted to do when I was studying towards the ATT and CTA was to go home and do some studying. So if you can get good quality out of the time that you do spend revising, then that's obviously going to be better. Because I knew that there wasn't much time outside of work and on weekends to do the studying. When I was doing my CTA, I remember looking for efficient ways in terms of time to study so that I could get, I suppose, as much benefit as possible out of the time that I did spend revising. And I found a lot of resources, which was YouTube videos and also some articles online, that were effectively saying that recall is a very effective way to revise, and by that I mean recalling the information and not just reading it, trying to recall it. It's really good for remembering information, and it's also really good for testing your understanding as well. It's supposedly scientifically proven. I haven't checked that for certain, but it did seem to be really effective for me when I was studying towards the CTA qualification. This is kind of why question practice and doing past exam papers is a really good way to revise for exams, because when you're doing those, you're having to recall and use the information that's in your head, and that's much more better, much more effective from a time point of view than it would be if you were just reading something. So one other way that I incorporated recall into studying for the CTA qualification was when I was trying to figure out, I suppose, where the gaps in my knowledge were, is I would go to the contents page of the study manual, the one that's detailed, that has all the subsections and all the subheadings in it. I would go through those and see if I could recall what the information was under each of those chapters and each of the subheadings. And if I was unsure when I was looking at the title, or I just wasn't able to recall it, then that was the point that I would go to the material to check if I was right, or to go and understand it if I didn't already. And then when I went to it, if I wasn't able to recall it or I did get it wrong, then I would make a flashcard to remember that information going forward. Now, I know when I was doing the CTA exams, it was not open book, so making flashcards might not be the best bet for you now, but you will not be able to rely solely on the material that you take into the exam, because you do not have the time to just keep going through it and finding the information you need. You still do need to remember some things, and if there's some information that you feel is really important that you can't seem to remember, then making a flashcard or something similar will still be effective anyway. So there are some other ways to be effective with your time, and I'm just going to list a few of these now, just so you get an idea of the things that you can do which are effective study and revision techniques. Are taking advantage of the most productive times of the day for you. So if that's in the morning, for example, straight after you wake up, it is for me. Do a couple of hours study session then, if you can, take into account, of course, that you might be working in the week, so you might only be able to do that on the weekends. Let's say it could be around lunchtime. So you could have a study or revision session at lunchtime. You can also be effective by making sure that you take breaks and don't cram, because if you just have a super long study session, after a certain amount of time, the effectiveness of that session is going to go downhill, and that's not going to be an effective way to revise for the exams. Try and think of quality, not quantity. Don't just set yourself targets of, I will do an hour's worth of revision tonight. Instead, set yourself a target of, I will understand this topic by the end of the evening, or I will do X amount of practice questions this evening, because that's going to give you good quality rather than quantity of time. Dedicate time to your weaker areas. I know we don't like to do it, but that is going to give you a lot of bang for your buck. So always spend time on your weak areas. Avoid reading study material as much as possible. Of course, if you don't remember something and you need to learn it and understand it, then go and read it, but always try and do recall first. See if you remember it, see what you do understand, and then try and fill in the gaps. That's much more effective than keep going and reading the same material over and over again. Avoid just highlighting materials as well. That is not going to be an effective use of time. Unless, of course, you're taking this material into the exam and you're trying to highlight the parts of information that you need. In that case, by all means, do that. And the last point is do as many practice questions, past exam papers, etc. as you can, because all of these are going to be good uses of your time. So tip number 3. So I've already touched upon this a little bit in the last tip, but this one is figure out what your weak points are and make sure that you dedicate time to improving them. Your weak points could be your knowledge and understanding of certain topics. It could be your exam technique, the speed of doing questions, so being able to do it in the allotted time that you're meant to have for each question. It could also be the materials that you're taking in and being able to use them quickly, for example. So whatever it is, figure out what your weak points are and then put time aside to make sure that you can improve them. So for me, one of the biggest weak points when I was doing the CTA exam, it was actually the speed of writing answers in the allotted time. Particularly early on in the revision phase, I was spending a lot more time than what was available to answer a question and get the right amount of marks from it. And that was what I found the most difficult. What I would personally do was I would time every single question that I did, not worrying about how long it actually took me. I just wanted to know the information so that I could do something with it. I would time myself, and then after the question, I would see how long it took me to do the question. And then based on how long it did take me, I'd think about, right, what could I do next time that would mean that I did the question quicker or got closer to doing it in the allotted time. And because I kept doing that, by the time I got to the exam, I was able to complete most questions in the allotted time. Some were obviously quicker, some obviously a little bit more. But that's the way it happens. But by the time it got to doing the exam, I was well improved in the speed department. So when I was doing practice questions, I would always be conscious of the time it was taking me and then always intentionally trying to speed up And that was the way that I got better at that. So whatever your weakness is, make sure that you dedicate time to improving it and think of a way that you can spend and improve that area so that it's no longer a weakness, or at least less of a weakness. You can't just focus solely on your weak points though, because then you'll be neglecting other areas. So you do need a balance, but it's easier for us to neglect our weaknesses because it's harder for us to deal with and it's harder for us to improve. So do make sure that you do put the time aside to spend working and improving on your weak points. So tip number 4 is practice using the materials that you are going to take into the exam. And if you're at the point now where you haven't decided exactly what it is you're going to take into the exam and you haven't prepared these yet, do this as soon as you can, because by the time this episode is out, it's going to be early April and you're not going to have much more than a month to get this in order. And this is going to be important because it's going to make such a big difference if you have a good set of materials that are organised and that you can quickly use and access the information that you need of quickly in the exam. So first off, make sure that you've got them ready, and then you need to make sure that you practice using them when you're doing practice questions and just generally trying to find the information that you know that you're going to need in the exam. So when I've spoken to Nitin Ribeiro twice now on the podcast previously, he says that he gives students 10 seconds to find the information that they need in the exam. So that should be the aim for you too. And if you don't practice using the materials before the exam, it's going to be almost impossible for you to find the information that you need consistently within that 10 seconds. I also know of one other person who sat the November 2020 exams, which were the first ones that are open book, and he decided to take in the study manual into the exam and use that as the material. That isn't a problem in itself, and if it works for you, it works for you, but the problem that they had was time. They spent so much time trying to find the material that they needed from the study manuals that they actually didn't manage to complete 2 of the questions in the exam. And when it comes to a CTA exam, not finishing 2 questions is absolutely massive. And the chances of you passing that exam are going to drop drastically if you haven't completed 2 questions. So it really does emphasise the importance of making sure that you've got materials that are working well for you, that you take into the exam, where you can access the information quickly. And the only way that you're going to become good enough at accessing that information quickly is by practicing. So you can do it with the practice questions, as I've already mentioned. Maybe you just want to test yourself by thinking, oh, I need to be able to find this piece of information, and then just going and do it that way. Both work. The question practice one and the past exam papers one is going to probably be the most obvious way to do it. But if you're feeling like you're really struggling in getting the material fast, then you might have to be creative and think of other ways that you can practice finding the information. Whilst I'm emphasising the need to be able to access the information quickly from the materials that you decide to take into the exam, you do not want to be entirely reliant on this material. You're not going to have enough time to find every piece of information that you need. As mentioned earlier, you still need to be able to spot the tax issues that are in point in the question, and then the material that you take in should be supplementary and helpful to you. You should not be relying on this entirely. Just one last point before we move on to the next tip. If you have already decided what materials it is that you're going to take into the exam, but when it comes to practice using them, it just isn't working for you, then don't be afraid to tweak the materials or maybe even change the approach and take some different materials in instead. But if you are going to do this, just make sure that you do it well in advance of the exam and not close to it, because you want to become familiar and have that time to practice using the actual materials that you're going to take into the exam. So tip number 5 is get plenty of exam and question practice as you can before the exam. And each time you do a practice question or a past exam paper, make sure that you squeeze as much benefit as you can out of each of those questions and exam papers that you do. Question practice and past papers are such an effective way to revise, mainly because you are using recall, which I mentioned earlier, and you're also practicing using the information that's in your head and applying it to exactly what you need to in the exam. When it comes to practice questions and past papers, because I think they are so valuable and you only have a limited amount of them, you do not want to waste any of them at all. And by wasting them, I primarily mean not attempting the question and literally just going straight to the model answer and reading that. That is a very passive way to revise, and it's not going to be that effective. And in my opinion, it is going to waste that question that you could have attempted and gotten a lot of value from. When you are doing practice questions and past exam papers, make sure that you are using the material that you're going to be taking into the exam. But as mentioned already, you don't want to be entirely dependent on it. So you need to make sure that you've got a good understanding of the topics, that you're able to spot the tax points, and whatever you do remember is going to be a big benefit in terms of time. Because I believe that practice questions and past exam papers are so beneficial, I always wanted to squeeze as much benefit out of these as possible. And to do this, after I'd written my answer to a question, or after I'd completed a past exam paper, I would go through immediately and look at the model answers and compare them to mine, and I suppose self-mark myself in the process. And when I was going through the model answers, I would then be thinking about any points that I missed. Did I get any points wrong? Is it clear whether there was some material that I didn't understand, for example? How was I doing on my timing, which is something I've already mentioned. And then once I'd gotten all that information, I could use it to improve my next attempt at a similar or other questions. Once I'd kind of self-reflected and got that feedback from myself, I could go and brush up on any parts that I didn't understand as well, or any areas that I've struggled on. I could make sure that I worked on them, and that for me was a really good way to squeeze as much benefit as possible out of each practice question, because not only had I attempted it, I then spent that time thinking about it and reflecting so that I could improve on writing answers going forward. I would also avoid repeating or doing any questions again that you've already done. And the reason I say this is because if you're doing a question again, that doesn't really train you on the technique of being able to spot the relevant tax points that are in play in the question. And I think this is one of the most important things for the CTA and the ATT qualification. It's being able to spot the relevant points. And if you're repeating and doing a question again that you've already done, then you already know what the points are really. You tend to remember when it comes to doing them. So I would just avoid doing that. And Nitin, who has been on the podcast 2 times already, both times he has mentioned that the most difficult part of these exams, from his experience with students, is being able to spot the relevant tax points in a question. And if you're repeating questions, you're not giving yourself the opportunity to practice that as often. I have already mentioned timings briefly in relation to the scenario for me, because that was the thing that I found most important. But when doing practice questions, I do suggest that you time yourself, but don't get too worried if you are taking longer than you should to complete a question, if you are more than 2 weeks away from the exam. This is something that Nitin said to me, and what he did say was, up until about 2 weeks before the exam, you don't actually know all the material, you haven't mastered your exam technique, and there's still a lot of things that you're learning. So being able to do the questions in the allotted time before then is difficult, and a lot of students do struggle with it. So don't worry about it too much. But if you're aware of it and you know that it's something that you need to work on, then just have the intention to try and improve that as you're going along. And when you get to the point of about 2 weeks before, that's when you really need to start taking more care to make sure that you are finishing questions within the allotted time. And this was entirely true for me. About the 2 weeks before, it kind of all clicked and fell into place. I can't really explain exactly how that happens or why it does, but it does seem to, you seem to become very focused when you come close to the exam, and making sure you stay within your timings when it comes to the actual exam is going to be important. But yeah, don't worry about it too much, much more before 2 weeks before the exam. My last point is, where you get any past exam papers or any other questions marked by tutors, then take full advantage of any feedback they give you. They obviously experience lots of students' answers and marking them and giving feedback. They've got a lot of experience in helping students to pass the exams. So any feedback that you get from them is going to be invaluable. So make sure that you take it on board and understand it. And if you don't understand it, try and get in contact with the person who wrote the feedback so that you can understand it and take the points on board going forward. Tip number 7 is keep the revision as interesting as you can by varying up what you're doing in your revision. So one of the hardest things I think about doing the ATT and CTA exams is getting that motivation to study after work and study on weekends when you may have already had a difficult or long week of work. I think one of the ways that you can make it more interesting and make it easier to motivate yourself to go and revise for the exams is to vary it up and do different things to keep it as interesting as you can. So when I was at university, one of the things I did to keep my revision interesting for my maths degree exams, and some people will probably find this a bit odd, but I didn't have a big whiteboard or anything like that. So instead I got whiteboard pens and would start doing practice questions and revising by writing directly onto my bedroom window. And that for me made it much more interesting than just sitting at the same desk all day, every day, writing on paper and doing the questions that way. It just got a bit dull and repetitive, and by doing something as simple as changing the way that I was doing that, it made it much more fun and easier to motivate myself to go and revise. Another thing I used to do, I did this both in ATT and CTA, and you may not have the luxury to do this, but if you do, try and go to different settings, which could be just a different room of the house. It could be to a library if the COVID situations allow it, for example, or it could be just in a completely different location. Whatever it is, anything you can do to do something a bit different, study in a different setting, it will make it more interesting, and I also think easier for you to motivate yourself to go and revise. Just have a little bit of an experiment if you've never done anything like this before. Find out what works for you, but whatever it is, do it, give it a go, and I think you'll find it helpful. One last point about varying it up before moving on to the next tip is you haven't just got to do it with changing your settings and the way that you're studying. It could be the topic that you're studying. It could be the fact that you've done loads of practice questions and now you want to do something else, whether that's creating a revision folder or practicing using the materials that you're going to take into the exam, or learning a few areas where you're weaker on. Whatever it is, swap it up. Try not to do the same thing for too long, because you will become more easily bored and less motivated if you do that. Tip number 7 is do the last mock exam that you have as if it's the actual exam. So sit it in the same room that you're going to sit the actual exam in. Do it to the right timings. Use the material that you're going to take into the exam. Whatever it is, make sure that you do it as if it is the actual exam. And yes, it might not go to plan and you may not do as well as you wanted to, but what it's going to do is give you really good practice of sitting the actual exam before you actually sit it, and anything that you noticed that you could improve on or weren't doing as well as you'd like, you can then go away and work on it before the actual exam. You may be a bit skeptical about this tip at this point, but just think about it. Would you rather find the things that you're not doing well enough now in a practice exam or in the actual exam? Because for me personally, I'd much rather find it out before the actual exam. So I can highly recommend that you do the last mock exam as if it is the actual one, and I believe it will work wonders for you. Tip number 8, which is the last tip for this episode, is aim to do at least some revision every single day. And now that may sound like absolute madness to you, but just hear me out for a second. One thing I've tried to instill throughout this episode is being effective with your available time that you spend on revising. And from a study and revision perspective, if you were to spend 2 hours revising on one day, or were to spend 30 minutes over 4 days doing the exact same revision, then you're going to get more out of those 4 shorter sessions than you are out of the one bigger session, just because it's going to be easier to maintain concentration and focus, and you're going to be more motivated in that shorter time period than you are in the longer one. So if you can do a little bit of revision every single day, that is in line with that philosophy. One of the hardest things to do, and I fully appreciate this because I felt the same way, was actually motivating myself after a long day at work to go home and do some studying. And the way that I would approach it to make sure you do something every single day is to just set yourself a really small goal rather than something big. And that could be, I want to do at least one practice question tonight. And then once you've done that practice question, you can stop if you want to. But the chances are that once you've started doing some revision on that day, you're probably going to spend longer than just doing that one question, because once you've started doing it, it's much easier to carry on. The hardest and the biggest hurdle is to just start. That way you're likely to be able to do at least something small every single day. Don't do something every single day though at the expense of overdoing it and burning out. So I would be lying to you if I said that I studied every single night after work when I was studying towards the ATT and CTA exams. I didn't. And I tried to do it most days, but some days I just really did not feel it and I felt like I needed a break. And it's okay if that's what you need to do. If you overdo it and burn out, then you're just going to have ineffective revision sessions, and that's just going to be no help either. So you want to make sure that if you're feeling that way, that you give yourself the time and space, I suppose, to revitalise yourself and have more effective sessions, say the day after or a couple of days later, if that's how much you need. Having that time to relax and de-stress is going to be super important in helping you to pass the exam, because if you go into an exam and you're just super stressed and absolutely sick of the material and doing the work towards these exams, and that is not going to be a good mindset for you. So give yourself time to relax, give yourself time to de-stress, and make sure that you are getting enough sleep, because all these things will increase your chances of having effective revision sessions and also being better on the day. I'm just going to leave you with a quick story from a book that I read called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, just to emphasise this point about making sure that you don't burn out and that you have revision time and relaxing and de-stressing time in like a good balance. And I think this story is really fitting for someone who is sitting the ATT and CTA exams. It just seems so relevant. So the story effectively is that there's a man who is cutting down a tree because he needs to do it by a certain point in time. But he's trying to cut this tree down with a really blunt and ineffective saw. And if this person would have just taken 10-15 minutes of his time to go and either get a better saw or to sharpen his saw in some way, then when he was cutting down the tree, he would have saved himself more than the 15 minutes that he spent getting the better tool or sharpening the saw to cut down that tree. But because this person was so engrossed in cutting down the tree at the time with this rubbish saw and he knew he needed to do it, he didn't even think to spend that little bit of time to go and do something which was actually going to save him time in the long run. And I think that applies directly to people who are studying towards the ATT and CTA exams. It can feel like because you've got a limited amount of time, and it feels like there's so much to learn and there's so many things that you want to get better at, that you could just pump in loads and loads of time into studying towards the exams and putting loads and loads of time into the revision phase of it. But really, if you would go and just spend a bit of time relaxing and de-stressing or making sure that you're getting enough sleep, then the chances are you're actually going to get that time back, because you would be so ineffective at doing the studying and the revision if you didn't go and take those breaks. That having that hour break here and there is going to save you probably more than an hour of time of revision, because you're going to get more effectiveness out of it. So I'll just leave you with that thought. So make sure that you do get the balance between studying and relaxing. It is about a fine balance. Doing either or is not going to be beneficial for sitting and passing the exams, of course. So finding a balance that works for you and keeps you effective and running smoothly in the revision sessions is going to be a good thing for you. In summary then, for this episode, tip number 1 is make sure you have studied all the material as soon as you can if you haven't already done this. Tip number 2 is be effective with your study time. Time is precious when revising for a professional exam, and you wouldn't want to be wasting that time by doing something that is inefficient. Tip number 3 is figure out what your weak points are and make sure that you dedicate enough time to improving them, whether it's your knowledge, your exam technique, practicing using the materials, whatever it is, make sure that you figure them out and dedicate time to improving them. Tip number 4, practice using the materials that you are going to take into the exam. And if you haven't decided what these are yet, figure out what they are and decide as soon as possible, but make sure that whatever it is that you decide works for you. Tip number 5, Get plenty of exam and question practice and squeeze as much benefit out of each of these that you complete as possible by making sure that you reflect on every single answer and think about how you can improve. Any feedback from tutors here will be invaluable, so make sure that you understand it and get as much as you can from the feedback. Tip number 6, keep the revision interesting by varying it up, whether that's to do with the material that you're using or the way that you're going about studying. Make sure you keep it interesting because that will make it easier to motivate yourself to go and do revision. Tip number 7 is do your last mock like it is the actual exam. And tip number 8 is aim to do at least some revision every single day, but make sure that you don't overdo it. Make sure you take breaks, rests, and have enough sleep so that the time that you do spend revising can be as effective as possible. As mentioned earlier in the episode, you can get a written summary of all the tips mentioned in this episode to easily remind you of them by heading on over to the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP22. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP22. If you would like more tips for passing the exams, you can listen to episode 5 and episode 19 of the podcast, where BBP ATT CTA lecturer Nitin Ribeiro joined me on the podcast and shared a wealth of useful information to help make sure that you pass the exams. Links to both of these can be found in the show notes or by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP5 or /TTPP19 because the number just stands for the episode number of the episode. But that's it for this episode. I hope you found the episode useful and have taken away some useful points that you can use to help progress and develop your tax career. Until next time.